Good to just hang out. It's webinars now streaming live on YouTube. Boy, Vey, you got all this all sorted out, haven't you? For
Dude, someone said that I was the Joe Rogan of the cybersecurity podcast. I took that as a compliment. And I say that now. And John Felker is here, man. John, what's happening?
John's on this? We got John on this as well?
Yeah, John's in the crowd, man.
Oh my gosh. I
love John.
Well. I'm not sure if that's I saw David stick a note out, and I'm like, I was wondering if that's David, the David Hurley I know, because there's not too many of them out there. David's an amazing and seriously amazing individual.
Yeah. This is going to be a very, very fun group.
We have a fun one with this one.
I can't wait for everyone who's we are live on YouTube too, so just so you know. I've got like multiple screens in front of me now, so
so we do the shit show on Thursday nights, and it's bad enough. You got Evan, Ryan, and I who are just sitting there, and like it's like, did we push the button yet? I don't know. Okay, we'll figure it out. And it's just, we turn up. I think we actually managed, out of the 30 or 40 episodes we've done so far, I think we actually managed to turn up on time once so far, which is, I'm like, yes.
So we've done, I'll say it like this. I do a 9 a.m. podcast every single day, and I go live at 0900 hours, no questions asked. I am a machine when it comes to going live. Even this morning, we did the other side of cyber in Australia, which, kicks off my time 0500 hours, and it's, 2000 hours in Sydney. And we were live at 0500.
So I'm good up until about 3 o'clock in the morning. Because again, working with the Israelis now over at Cynet, it's I'm good till about 2 or 3 in the morning, my time zone, and then I'm like, I'm done. I'll see all of you at 10 a.m. and by hook or by crook, getting me out there much before 10 o'clock in the morning, yeah, that shit ain't gonna happen. Just don't ask for it. It's not gonna be pretty.
Yeah, that Spencer says that's 6 a.m. PST. Yeah, it is. You should. That's the beauty of living in. I've had to like soundproof my basement.
Yeah.
So that no one in the house hears me, especially when we have guests over. All right, so it's 3 o'clock. We're bound to start. We'll give people a few more minutes just to roll in, simply because there's a double sign in to make sure that we keep undesirables off of Zoom.
Wrap out.
And then we'll get started on today's webinar, kind of our CISO talk conversation, which I absolutely love. Getting a bunch of CISOs in one spot, and then getting Nick. Like I did a 1-minute video talking about this webinar that I put on LinkedIn, and I said this webinar is going to have 3 things that you're never going to have in any other panel. It's got Nick for business, it's got Gray for practitioner, and it's got Chris for the devil's advocate. You don't get that any other panel. You don't. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. You typically get 4 people who all like just go, what he said's really, really smart.
Yeah.
This is the panel where we're going to be really handling some very, very tough questions. So, and Felker says, what's everyone drinking for this St. Patrick's Day? That's David. I've got a Glenlivet, Dave. And
nice.
And yeah, John's on here. And if you guys don't know John Felker, John used to run the NKIC at CISO.
He's amazing. So much love for him.
That man is not only a patriot, he is a true cyber warrior in every sense of the word.
He dealt with more red tape in one set of I guess, deployments than I think I've ever wanted to deal with in my entire life.
Indeed. Yeah. All right, so let's get started. So everyone, welcome to the CISO Talk webinar. Thank you so much for tuning in. For those that have been kind of joining, you kind of got a pre-stage workout of us just kind of bantering. More Chris and me bantering, and Nick just observing us, and Gray all decked out for his St. Patty's Day. Although it's not St. Patty's Day in Australia, because it's Thursday morning in Australia.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, it's 5 a.m. here in Brisbane. So most people who really celebrated St. Pat's Day are very much in bed, passed out right now.
But that's only because they just got home.
Exactly. I can hear the taxis out there now.
So we've got an awesome panel, and I kind of gave a prelude to that just a minute ago. We've got Nick Sorensen, the CEO of Wistic, and Wistic is the company that's supporting today's webinar. So thank you, Nick, for your support and helping put this together. And Nick's the CEO of Wistic. We have Gray Meyer Gleaves. And if you guys don't know Gray, selfless, shameless promoting of me and Gray, but we did do a podcast a few weeks ago. You should go check it out. I think an hour and 20 minutes, but well spent, like a lot of fun. I do long form cybersecurity podcasts. I believe in long form. And we've got, Chris Roberts, obviously now the cybersecurity, the security strategist over at Signet, right?
Yeah, I think something like that.
Something like that. They've given you some title.
Pretty much, yeah. Something
but we just call you the devil's advocate, and
that works.
We'll leave it at that. So we're talking about securing the supply chain today. And for those that are live on YouTube or LinkedIn, you guys can comment. We do see your comments. We're able to address your questions. So feel free in the chat and in the Q&A to pose your questions, and we'll take those as we go along. But really, we're talking about securing the supply chain. And I'm not going to go down the SolarWinds thing because I think SolarWinds was a very sophisticated supply chain attack. But when we look at the software supply chain, there are enormous amount of threats there, and they're really highlighting the challenge in managing our supply chain. And so I kind of want to go around the horn here and kind of talk a little bit about why is supply chain now trending? It's like if it was on Twitter right now, supply chain would be trending. If like we should have like our own little like Twitter hashtag thing, because supply chain would be trending. But why is it so hard to just wrap our heads around supply chain right now from a security perspective?
I'll take a first stab at that if you want, because it's let's hit the software one. I think the software one is the software and applications. We go back in our history, security history. We had 3 layers to deal with. We had the application, the web, the application, the database. That's all we really had to worry about. Now, when you look at it, you look at the stack of software, of systems, of applications, and some of it's in the cloud, and some of it's in containers, and some of it's in virtual environments, and some of it's handled over here, and some of it's there. And by the way, we've got virtualization systems all over the place. And on top of that, we've got, a DevSecOps community that's built up all of this, all this intellectual property and all the software from a variety of sources, and they've pulled it from JetBrains and GitHub and all these other repositories. You put it, and shit works. It's cool. It's really, really good. We have no clue whose hands are on the keyboards. We don't know who's dealing with it. We don't know whose fingers are in it. We don't know how well supported it is, how well managed it is. Fred over in the far corner built a really nice widget that makes your website pop, and you're using that. If Fred's still alive or dead, let alone if his code's any good, let alone who the hell Fred is when it goes wrong. So we've taken all these disparate systems from all these places, put it all together, and it looks really cool, but we have no clue under the covers really what's making most of it tick.
Yeah, just to chime in off that, Chris, so interesting comment from Demi just came in. Third parties became your new perimeter.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to put it, right? Because of the business benefits of these third-party applications that have very clear adoption amongst all companies globally, and that trend is accelerating. That kind of trend mixed with the trend of data sharing and access in our sort of last 5-10 years, accelerating almost exponentially, not stopping anytime soon, kind of mix those up into the same bucket, and you have a really interesting spotlight just being shined on this, and then flash the news headlines and all the other things that we're all aware of, and really interesting just environment that we're living in as it relates to third-party vendor security.
Absolutely. And I think, a really good one is, I was on another CISO forum during the week with a whole bunch of folks from different companies in Australia here. And, you know, someone talked about the fact that it's no longer BYOD, it's BYOA, bring your own application, right? So for years we struggled with here's the device that we own. Now we're going to let people run their own device and we'll tell them what apps to run. Now we're getting into a world where it's BYOA. And, you know, for me as a CISO, I look at this and I go, where do we sit in the overall supply chain? Because I've got my downstream and then my suppliers. I've got my upstream, which are our partners, you know, and some of our stakeholders. And I think now there's two other streams that are sitting there because it is so complex, because the supply chain is not only deep, but it's also broad. So I've kind of termed side stream, and side stream is really then your own IT shop. These are the apps that you develop yourself. But even that supply chain can be deep. You're using lots of different tool sets, right? You're using, you know, code repositories. You're, you know, blending it in with different sort of IaaS, SaaS, PaaS, etc. Right? There's nothing that's just clean anymore. And then, of course, there's what I call a slipstream, and that's where your organization just sits in amongst a whole industry or a whole category getting dragged along in that slipstream. And the reason I say that is that it's a day and age now where you can't buy things and install them on premises. You know, there's plenty of solutions that come to market right now. You know, Nick, Wistic, I can't just go and buy it and go and install it on a server, right? And I'm happy with that because I do want it as a service. But now no longer is that choice. And then the supply chain is very deep because every organization is using different suppliers and it can almost be infinite. So as a CISO, that becomes really challenging because the layers of trust become deep, or no trust becomes deep.
Well, I mean, to your trust point, let's add to that. If you are at, let's say, the top of the food chain, so you are consuming and you have the third parties coming into you, you've got a stack of paperwork that's about that thick this month that you have to fill in on compliance and regulation. And now, not only do you have to fill that stack in, you have now got to pretty much attest to the fact that your supply chain is good. So now I've got to give that stack or a subset of that stack to, you know, I've got to give a subset of that stack to Nick and go, hey, Nick, I need to make sure that as you handle my data, that you're compliant with all of these things. And Nick's getting 100 of these. And then Nick's got to look at them and go, well, where's my supply chain? And all of a sudden, you have an entire supply chain that's doing nothing more than trying to validate itself without enough resources, without enough hands, without good eyes, without a simple, easy way to deal with this stuff. And half the time it's a self-attestation. You're like, well, yeah, we're probably fine. Click and hope for the best. And so we're relying on that as well.
So let's look at this from a different perspective. So you guys talked about trust. So trigger warning for everyone watching and listening. I hate the word zero trust. I despise it. I think it's bad for business. I think it's bad in general. I know it's a good concept. I understand the strategy behind zero trust. I don't like the name, but I think the challenge with it is, as we look at our supply chain, you know, a lot of people are kind of making the case for zero trust, and I'm kind of I want to make the case for transparency and partnerships.
I agree.
Right. So, you know, there's a lot of great comments coming in. And if we look at this from this perspective, right, kind of feeding off those comments, what if instead of zero trust, we implied more transparency? And we created some level of transparency where I know that if Chris is my vendor, but Chris uses two other vendors who their services he's relying on to provide me service, I'd like to know who those two vendors are, not to circumvent Chris, but rather to be able to position myself and defend my organization.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about trust and transparency. And Nick, I'd like to kind of kick off with you on this one because you're the business side of it. So when you hear zero trust, what do you think?
Well, I think part of what you're just talking about, James, if you think about the friction in this whole process, which there's a ton of friction, you know, me getting to trust with my third-party vendors, vetting the security of an organization that I work with that has access to my data, those types of things. Most of the friction, and this might be an overstatement, most of that friction is because a lot of this is this black box with a lack of transparency. And if you open up more of that black box, have a spectrum of no transparency and more transparency, generally speaking, you reduce friction as you get more transparent. It doesn't solve all problems, but one of the most challenging pieces that's an everyday pain for a lot of people listening in today is just, I don't even know who to engage at my third-party vendor to get the answers to the questions I want to know. I want to understand what's behind that black box. And interestingly enough, that trend is going more towards transparency. So we're starting to see, even over the last 5 years, more and more organizations expecting that from their vendors, from their third parties, expecting more behind the scenes collaboration like we're talking about, as opposed to there's a black box that I just want to sort of have this adversarial type relationship and I'll make my own determination. So I think that's definitely, from my perspective, the industry needs that. We've got to get to a more transparent place, not because it solves all problems, just because the way that we're doing it today is broken. And most of the time and effort and business friction is around the administrative items that don't really add value from a security perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Gray?
Look, as a CISO, I really dislike the term zero trust. I mean, it's when you're working with your business, you're working across your organization, and people is a big part of cybersecurity. And to walk out there and sort of say, hey, we've got zero trust in everybody, that just doesn't start well, right, for a conversation for me. I think it's more about establishing the different levels of trust. And I'll give you an example. I heard from a pilot at a presentation last week, and he'd been involved in what was nearly one of the biggest aircraft disasters, but they safely landed the plane. And he said the safest flight you will go on is one where the crew's never flown before together. Okay, now think about that. That doesn't sound right? In your mind, you're kind of like, wouldn't you think that if you've all been flying together for 25 years, that would be the safest flight? Well, not really. When you hear why, part of it is around trust in the people that sit down in that cockpit, or the crew that comes together. There's an element of trust due to the fact of the certifications and the training and the experience, etc., that is with that crew when they come together. And they're also checking each other constantly because they're also new coming together. Okay, so when you think about the logic of that, you go, well, you know what? That's absolutely correct. And when I hear that, I think more and more about the fact, well, that's what we've already started doing with our third parties. And there's only more and more of that to do. Because you think about it, let's look at it another way. You've been working with let's just say you've been working with an IT provider or a supplier for 20 years. You probably didn't do the same sort of checks on them that you would do right now on a new supplier coming into your own organization. So because you're comfortable. And you sit there going, we've been working with these guys for quite a long time. They're cool, we're cool. Nothing bad's happened yet. So you're comfortable. And then yet you're screening or really putting through some new supplier through a whole bunch of scrutiny. So my point there is we kind of got to treat some of these things just like, aviation, where they're coming together. But even if they have worked together a lot, there's a lot of checks. And this is where I think the value of, certification comes in, independent certifications, checking out their experience. And then to exactly your point, James, that transparency, right? Because we want to build trust, but zero trust is not a great way to sort of explain this or even start from, I think. You've got to expect that there's some sort of level of trust to begin. It's just how much trust is there overall?
All right, so I'm throwing the devil's advocate card on this one, and we're going to do two words: Boeing 737 Max.
Good point.
Yeah,
failed miserably. Not only failed miserably, but then when it went to recertify, it failed again because the trust authority failed the system itself. And I think you're right on a bunch of that. But I don't know if there is a good industry that we can hold up as a place to go. Again, I think part of it is we're so, as security and in industry, we don't have the maturity of a finance industry or manufacturing. We don't have the tens, hundreds, thousands of years of maturity to figure all of this out. And we're making shit up as we go along, let's be honest. And I think that's also part of it. This is why we find ourselves with so many different compliance and regulatory backgrounds, that everybody's just like, well, we haven't got a set of standards, we'll modify them and we'll call them our new set of standards. So we have a lot of confusion in the industry. But to me, this whole zero trust, back to what James was saying on the zero trust, we've had that in networking terms for 20, 30 years. We called it separation and segmentation. And we should still have it. If you think about it, everybody's complaining about the fact I can get to like operational technology. So I can get to your SCADA systems or your smart grids or any of that stuff. Well, if we had proper network separation and segmentation, shit wouldn't happen. But we don't have it at that layer, and yet we're still expecting it at the human layer and the application layer and the system layers. Again, to me, it's back to the fundamental. It's back to the basics. Nick mentioned it when he was talking about the communication and the collaboration. We have got to bring more of that to the forefront.
It's almost like we need our own almost collaboration platform from a security perspective, right? To where we're able to do kind of like the continuous transparency and the things that happen. I mean, if you look at Microsoft Exchange right now, right, and just the vulnerabilities within Microsoft Exchange and the impact that it has on so many organizations, and the discussion to be had from a business perspective, right, which I think is where it all comes down, because now you go to your board and you start to talk vendor risk management, and you go, well, we're on Microsoft because, well, 70% of the world's on Microsoft, if not more, right? I think it's 70% on Microsoft Exchange.
It's crazy, man. Yeah, it's
right.
Huge.
So you're talking about, they say 30,000 companies. I have internal sources telling me it's that pump that number up and keep pumping. And there's a song from the 90s called Pump It Up, Pump Up the Jam. Just keep pumping up the jam on this one, because it's really going to go farther and higher. And so if we talk about vendor risk management, which is not centralized, run by guess what? Microsoft Excels, and predominantly done periodically, and then entrusted with a SOC 2 report or an ISO certification, which really tell you nothing about, software, lifecycle development and software, kind of integrity and security and code reviews and all that other stuff. So let's talk a little bit about how do we start addressing, I think, that's the real elephant in the room. That's the real challenge. How do we start addressing that?
I mean, there have been some attempts. I mean, let's be honest. There was, and I can't remember who did it. I wish I could remember, but there were a couple of attempts while you were talking about it. There were a couple of attempts to literally put an ingredients list on software and on systems. What's contained in Exchange, or what's contained, if we look at Nick stuff, Nick would have to put an ingredients list. What software, what apps, what components, what third parties, and all that stuff. And there was a really good movement to try and do that at various different levels in the industry, but it didn't gain enough traction, not by far and away. There have been a couple of initiatives to hold vendors accountable, to hold people accountable, but they haven't gained enough traction. We ourselves, I don't feel, have got, until somebody yells at us and puts another set of compliance and regulations in place, there doesn't seem to be there's not a driver for doing this. We're still getting business. Exchange is still selling like hotcakes. Everybody's still buying F5s, despite the fact they put 20 odd CVSSs out last week, and we all know how many places they're in. We're all still buying this shit. So there's no real incentive to do it.
Yeah, one of the things I think about, James, on that topic is just, so you've got half of the industry that doesn't do anything today still, or at least half.
Yep.
You got the other half that's trying. You've got a small portion that's doing actually a pretty good job in a lot of those more established industries that Chris is talking about, likely with heavy regulation. And Gray can speak to more of that. But I think One of the things that we're thinking a lot about at Wistic is certainly meeting the market where it is today. We got to help with some of the basics, blocking and tackling. But the thing that gets us fired up in the vision for the future is really this concept of collaboration. I think we talked about this on one of our prep calls. Just the enemy is collaborating really well. They do a great job of it.
Unbelievable.
But are we? And so that's one of the things that we think about it on this topic is just, so you've got transparency as a theme. You've got collaboration as a theme. One-offs. So me addressing my third parties without any insight into what Chris and Gray are doing at their organizations for their third parties isn't the best approach. Why don't we sort of unite the efforts and collaborate on that together? And that's not an easy nut to crack, but that's sort of one of the things that we think about as the future and the evolution of this. Certainly you got to get that half of the industry that doesn't care to care. You've got to help, meet the rest in the middle and on the way. But that collaboration aspect, we feel is really important. I feel is really important.
Yeah. And look, I agree there because, I really do think that there's been some great work done in particularly last few years, the Cloud Security Alliance, the Vendor Security Alliance, SOC 2, ISO 27001 is definitely, picking up more and more. To me, when I'm looking at, a third party, these help establish a bit of that baseline or an element of trust level. Now, I still do expect transparency there, right? So we still need to go through that process and make sure, and validate certificates and also look at some of the evidence from, more of those higher risk third parties. And when I say higher risk, I mean higher risk to our organization based on our own risk modeling, not necessarily what they may do, but also, and I want to say this is, I mentioned before that bring your own application. And I mean, like any CISO, we've got an entire organization that's kind of running to you all the time saying, hey, we want to use this app and we want to use that app and we want to do this. And of course, you've got to try and support your business, right? You've got to try and support your organization because, the bigger you get, you're up against more and more startups and disruptors and the pace of business is fast. And you can't be a CISO that just sits there going, no, and no, right? Because, and even if you say maybe, which is the way that we do answer things these days, or yes, of course, but we need to check things out, you've got to be able to do it quickly and fast. So I tend to gravitate as a CISO towards third parties that are being transparent. You go to their website straight away and you go, oh, cool, this one, they've got a security page. Excellent. And now I go into there and I can see, oh, they've got these certifications and, they're actually showing a whole bunch of data and they're quite happy to go and answer our questionnaire and things like that. And here's the contact details of their compliance team. And straight away I start going, wow, you know what? These folks have got it together. These guys are being transparent. But when I go to a site and I see this, really the black box mentality, we're hiding everything, we're not interested in doing your questionnaires and we've got 0 certifications, then I start looking at them going, well, really, are they investing? Are they being transparent? And that's something that comes to my mind as a CISO, because you know what, we haven't got time. We haven't got the time these days to go and spend days and weeks just evaluating some little application that the organization wants to use that's going to cost $1,000 a month. It's just not worth the manpower. So we've got to use more of that automation, and we use Wistic, so I'll be very public about that. That's a tool set that we adopted, and we like that because of the automation that it brings, and we're no longer bouncing around Excel spreadsheets and things like that. But I'm still out there looking for those third parties that are transparent and that I can say, hey, I can build up a level of trust with them straight away from what they've done. But that doesn't mean you've ticked all my boxes. You're still going to have to do a little bit more work before we're going to let you in the front door and use them.
So I chucked a message out to the audience because I want to talk about punitive, because if you think about it, for many, many years, there was a stick held over our head. I did a bunch of work in the retail space, and it was, the stick was, oh, if you don't pass PCI, or if you don't get along the pathway to PCI, Visa will, basically take your ability to take payments using their credit system. And I can't think, and somebody can correct me, please feel free. I can't think of an instance where that's actually ever happened. So for 10 to 15 years, you've had the stick, but it's never been used. And GDPR is another one where they're like, well, you know, if you fail or if you don't do this, we're going to fine you. Well, the problem is there's so many bloody incidents that they can't even keep up. They don't have enough people to keep up with the structure. So we're getting away with shit. So there's no penalty. There's no stick. There's no, as much as I hate, that's what they go by. If there's no negative implications, why the hell should I spend the time doing it? Why do I need to invest $1 million? I get breached, insurance will pay for it, stock gets a bump for a couple of weeks, everything's fine again, off we go again. There's, unfortunately, because we've become so almost immune to the breaches now, it's any costs are a cost of business, any issues, there's no crazy punitive damages. And, you know, to Gray's point, it's, yeah, maybe I'll lose a company or two, but maybe I won't. They're just going to accept that it is what it is.
Yeah, this is one of the points, Chris, that I think about from the collaboration perspective. If we as a community of security professionals get together and actually decide not to work with vendors that are dollars in a lot of ways, and like you said, if F5 is continuing to get purchased, all of these things, you know, continue to happen, then, so in one way, you could think of that penalty or the stick in the, we've got to see the shift from the buyer side. InfoSec professionals from the buyer side have to have that ability, backbone, whatever you call it, to say, no, this isn't worth working, and together kind of joining arms together saying, you need to up your game in order for us to collectively work with you or do business with you. That is one of the areas that we see. It's not happening today, like you called out, but that's one area where we could see change happen.
I would love
it. Rising.
Fantastic. It goes back to that, you know, I want to see a menu or grading, you know, NSS and those guys were trying to do some of that. And again, you know, some of their lab stuff, but again, it's expensive to go through. And I think it's only a subset. You know, when I look at an EDR, if I'm looking at an EDR or endpoint system, number one, is it just antivirus with more marketing? Is there more meat behind it? And then who's going to take care of me? Who's got my best interests? Because there's no easy scale for that. Oh, you're relying on your vendor who's bringing the 3 or 40th. So now you've got to rely on your vendor to bring you 3 or 4 good companies and hope that they're not getting, you know, back ends. They're not getting extra spiffs on the back end for putting one up in front of the other. So, and there's all sorts of challenges. There's no good grading system for any of this stuff. And I think that's also part of the problem. You hit the nail.
So you talk about grading systems. So another trigger, I like to do trigger warnings, right? We all have different frameworks. Is it time that we as practitioners come up with a supply chain risk management framework that isn't done by bureaucrats or someone who stands to profit from it, but rather by an actual system that stands to serve the interest of the general community as a whole, right? Because when you look at vendor risk management, there's something very interesting in the model of managing your risk, which is I speak to you before we integrate while we're still shopping you. I clear you based on a specific method. Now, here's a question to the panel. How many of you guys have had the integration change and been notified significantly without you actually knowing?
Find out behind the scenes. Yeah, typically you find out way afterwards. You're like, well, that would have been good to have known X amount of time before, because we would have changed how we've just spent the last couple of months.
Yeah.
I mean, we were on a CISO conversation just earlier this week, and we were talking about the fact that one of them was one of the CISOs on the call was sharing the fact that they did a due diligence. They kind of cleared the vendor on a specific set of integrations within a specific system. Well, come time to integrate, when does integration ever go as simple or as it's drawn out in the pre-sales meeting? That's a rarity. It required some customization, and the business really wanted to add the thing on, and no one considered to talk to security about the fact that they're changing the implementation and the integration, and integrated them anyways, which created an entire new risk vector for the organization. So it kind of bodes the question of, when we talk about vendor risk management, is one time enough, or is a yearly SOC 2 audit enough? Or should we be looking at something a little bit more continuous and something a bit more, kind of, like I said, partnership and transparency is what I want the theme to be. So should that be the case? And if that's what's it look like?
Am I allowed to be blunt? I mean, I'm
Yes,
going to be blunt.
that's
All
the
right.
only way you can be on here. If you want to be scripted, I'd say, there's plenty of other.
Is it possible for you not to be blunt?
Let's be perfectly honest with each other, okay? I wipe my ass with toilet paper that has more worth than a SOC 2 audit.
Cheers to that. I will second that.
Yeah.
I'm going to devil's advocate that, but I'll let you finish your comment, Chris.
Oh, yes. Nick's up. Yes.
My frustration with it, with a lot of it, number one, it's either a level of self-attestation, or it's that I've come in at one point in time, I've sat down and I've asked a series of questions, and somebody has done a really good job of either kind of telling me the truth, kind of hiding the skeletons, kind of maybe-ish, not probably really. And we rely on that, and we use that to quantify security. And let's face it, it's not what it is.
Yeah, so I agree with that concept, Chris. I think that value that I see in that, though, is just a starting point, right? And so you have this baseline. Gray talked about a baseline. And so you see a lot of companies being introduced to concepts in a SOC 2 audit for the first time as a result of that. Not that it's an end all be all, but I think back to your question, James, about do we need another framework? I don't know. There's a lot of frameworks. People have this concept of yet another framework, yet another questionnaire, right? They're all sort of covering similar things. We've got some pretty interesting sort of global communities like Cloud Security Alliance that are member peer-based, where you have the chance to collaborate on things like this. I don't necessarily believe we need another one of those. We need to leverage what we have today. They need to talk better to each other. But it's almost like, let's gather all the collective efforts that are doing these side things and really hone in on a couple and really make those work. There's certain industries as well that benefit from specialization and things like that. But just to share on the audit itself, it's a starting point similar to ISO and other things. We can't expect something to be perfect. It's not going to be the only thing we look at. But in a lot of ways, because 50% of the industry isn't doing anything or focusing on the vendor side, you got to have some starting point to engage on. So that's where I would push back a little bit on that, is just it's at least a starting point, right? And you have an engagement to start to get a little bit more transparent, and you'd rather have it than not in most cases, right? And because it is a shared dialogue. One of the benefits of that as well is it's a shared vocabulary in a lot of ways.
Well, it unifies the language.
Unifies the language. That's what I was looking for, James. Yeah, just some way to communicate and start the conversation is helpful.
I think the challenge, and Chris, I'm going to be devil's advocate there as well, is that I don't think that they're a complete waste of time. I think, as I said earlier, it helps establish a baseline or some level of trust, and it's a bit like, when you go and get your learner's license in Australia, you just go and do a computer test, and that means you can sit in the car and be the learner driver while someone more experienced sits next to you. But at the end of the day, you've got no experience. That license is still no guarantee that you're not going to cause an accident or go out there and kill someone. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but it can. And we haven't got that perfect. So, I see some of these, certification schemes as being, kind of the old plates, or, just establishing a certain level. After that, we get into the more complex areas, and that's where I start relying on my security engineers and my architects and my pen testers and everybody else looking at how a system or a solution's been put together, because they're so complex now. I don't think there's anybody else now in IT that has as complex job as the security folks do. We've got to look at the X, Y, and Z axis in everything that goes on in IT. And there's very little areas within IT. In fact, I can't think of any other part that has to look at all of those from all of those angles. And if there was a fourth dimension, security would have to look at it, right? Or a fifth or a sixth dimension. So, you know, to me, these certifications do set a baseline of trust, you know, or bring you to a certain level. But it's certainly not the, you know what, they've got that, I'm going to tick that box and everything else is good, right? And the job's done. It's just not like that.
Can I devil's advocate the devil's advocate for shit and giggles? I'm going to read you something.
This is another dimension of devil's advocate.
Oh,
I love it.
hell yeah.
I'm lost.
Oh, hell yeah. So I'm going to read you something.
Yeah.
We ensure you are running a tight ship today and in the future, and that you don't lose unnecessary time preparing for and working through a lengthy manual audit process. A smooth automated audit and a squeaky clean SOC 2 report are the direct outcomes of working with us. Beyond that, using us speaks volumes in terms of how you do business. They guarantee that you will pass an audit. I'm sorry, you're not a special fucking snowflake. You have to fail sometimes. And this is my promise. The same thing with certifications. I will guarantee that you'll pass your CISP, CEH, and everything else, because you're going to pay me enough money to pass it. That's where it loses value.
Yeah,
just like a driver's license, you know, you get your license doesn't mean you're a good driver, right? You know, and we've dealt that for a long time. And I think we're dealing with the same issue right now in security, right? And it's not easy. We've got people that are producing technology and services, and some of them don't even have their L plates or their learner's license, which is really scary, right? I think, you know, like the 5-year-old that drove to McDonald's there a few years ago, right, after watching a YouTube video. And unfortunately, our industry is full of that.
Right.
Yeah, and you hit on an interesting one, Chris, because we're in a renaissance of SOC 2 right now, for one example, because of the automation platforms that have gotten funded recently. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. We certainly need to be aware of the differing value from auditor to auditor and from report to report, right? So that's an interesting trend to keep our eyes on. One other unrelated, is related to that thread, but just another thought I had is just, as you think about the buyer side of the equation here, and Gray, maybe you could attest to this as well, but once you engage with a third-party vendor that is transparent, once you taste that, you don't want to go back to the black box, right? And so I think when we talk about because there's this question that got posed in here, what carrots and sticks do you have? I think there's that interesting trend. If you taste enough of that transparency from a third-party vendor, then what will happen over time is your team expects that from the next one and the next one. And not that it solves all of the problems, but in a lot of ways, the biggest carrot is those are the wheels that get greased and the other ones get stopped in the tracks and the buying process slows down or the buying doesn't happen, back to our other comments. So that's not easy to do, but as an industry, that's one of the things that we can work on and can help with, is just that dynamic of benefiting or rewarding those who are transparent. I was on a conversation with a security leader who basically said that I would rather know what you're dealing with, the challenges that you have as a third-party vendor and your dirty laundry, than to just sort of get the thumbs up. Like, I want to engage with you on that. I can help you with that even. You know, I can address those things together in a partner relationship. I would rather be in that spot than in the reverse. So just a couple of related thoughts on that.
And look, I'll back that, because, you know, we you know, in my job over many years at a number of different organizations, the use of this type of tool set, you know, as part of that risk management process, has led to a increase in maturity by the partner or the supplier. Okay, when there's a great working relationship and they've answered all the questions honestly, you know, Chris, they haven't tried to, you know, hide the skeletons in the closet and not talk about the body buried in the backyard and all that sort of stuff, right? Where they've actually been transparent.
Yeah.
has actually led to some really good outcomes, for the organization at the time that I've worked for, plus the organization in actually getting investment, maturing their cybersecurity posture, putting in some controls that quite frankly should have been there in the first place anyway, right? From a right point of view. Now, does it guarantee that there's not going to be a data breach one day? No, of course it doesn't, right? And I think we all know that, we've got a plan for failure because it will happen at some stage. So, it is important and it is effective. And it does, I consider a lot of this to also be the litmus test. When I send out a questionnaire to a third party, if they're not wanting to answer it, then straight away I'm like, this is warning signs. If they're trying to hide behind black box style, or, we don't disclose that or anything like that, to me, that's alarm bells, right? And as a CISO, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that.
Vendor the other day that was talking about their invisible processes. I talked about it with Evan, who runs FR Secure, Evan and Ryan. They were talking about somebody, invisible processes. I'm like, you're kidding me. Yeah, I'm like, I hate you.
So, I mean, I'll say this. I developed an Excel spreadsheet as a CISO where I ask you the same question 6 different times, 6 different ways.
Oh, so you're doing the psychological sort of warfare.
As a former Intel guy, it is like buried in my bones. Like there's like, if you, like when I ask you a question, there's no way I take your answer the first time around. I really, trust but verify, as President Reagan once said. So I trust but verify different aspects of how you integrate with us, 5 or 6 different ways, depending on the complexity of the integration. And yes, John says, and you get 6 different answers. Yeah, sometimes I get 6 different answers to the same question 6 different times. But that, what that does is, my team and the people who I deal with on this now look at this and go, now we get it. And the business gets it, right? Because we're now understanding what kind of skeletons exist in the closet and also the level of maturity. Now, I'm not trying to, I think what's very important for security people to kind of explain is we're not trying to stop you from doing business with company X. We want to make sure that as we work with company X, the relationship can mature and be a successful one, and one of why you want to work with company X to begin with, whatever the reason is.
Well, James, there's one thing that disturbs me here. You mentioned Excel. So my name's Gray, and I have not used Excel for any vendor security assessments for about 361 days now. Please, James, get out of the dark ages. Don't use it.
So I will say this. I am talking to Wistic about actually taking my questionnaire and putting it in digital format.
Absolutely. You definitely need to evolve there, James. I'm a little bit concerned, I must say.
The conversation is being had as we speak. But yeah, we have tried to move that. See, the thing about my Excel is it's got a key. So when we get it back, we actually, like, one of my guys just essentially copies and pastes all the answers into the key, and we get a score. And we, I've worked really hard on this Excel, Gray. Like, I know you haven't used one for 361 days.
You're wedded to it now, right? So you know what? About a year or so ago, when I, came in as the CISO at Hollard, and I just said, you know what? I've got to find something different. I've got to get away from Excel. I've got to let it go. I've been using it for 20 years. It's time for a change. And, what I do enjoy is that, I've got a dashboard that I can look at instantaneously. When people are ringing me up, where are we at with this, people? I've got this dashboard I just go straight to, right? So I think, I'm always looking as a CISO for efficiency, so that I can also have the team invest more of their time in some of the more practical things. Because the larger you get, I mean, some of you on the call, I don't know who can win the record, but I'm sure. Well, let me give you an example. In Australia, the financial services sector is regulated. Our regulatory body introduced a new standard last year, or that came into effect mid last year. And part of that is you must complete information security and cyber assessments of all your third parties, all of them, okay, without exception. Now, they don't tell you how to do that, but they tell you that you must do that. So if you're an insurance company, that means assessing everybody from people who repair motor vehicles, people who come and do repairs in your houses, right through to your big end of town, whether it's your Microsofts or your AWSs, et cetera, right? So that's a huge scale of different third parties you've got to assess. So in financial services, you don't have the luxury in Australia, and I don't know, I'd love to hear from the group here if there's any of that already in the US, right? But now suddenly I can't just go, you know what, I'm going to look at my top 20 high risk folks and fire out Excel to them. I've now got hundreds of third parties that I need to review from a security point of view. And I tell you what, if you look down the barrel of Excel, James, I love your thoughts there, but you start going, oh my goodness.
No, listen, I agree.
So I'm giving you a hard time,
I will say this. I agree. And I've spoken to the guys. I've spoken to Nick's team about actually doing this. In fact, John Finizia was like pressing me on like just transitioning it into Wistic, and I'll probably do it. And I may create a version where anyone could use my system with their vendors, like for free on Wistic. Like seriously, I think it'd be a lot of fun to just like go to an existing vendor and just be like, let's see how truthful you are. Think about it. It's like giving like your like X like truth serum and then being able to ask her, did you really cheat on me that one time when you said that, you were at your mom's?
James,
that's an option.
Yeah, interesting comment from John. He's joking about you got 6 different answers, but I think that speaks to the fact that there's no silver bullet in this. That's why we need the professionals. That's why these teams exist, right? Like that's why that comment that Gray or Chris, somebody mentioned about how important the individuals on the team are, because it's part interrogation, it's part fact finding, it's part technical, and there's no one score that can get spit out that can say yes, trust them or not. It's a lot of in between and a lot of data points that need to get pulled together, and there's a person in the heart of all of that that's kind of computing all of this. And so yes, we need to automate and get efficient in all of those pieces, but it's also just respecting the fact that this is not a simple exercise to perform in a lot of ways.
The other challenge on a lot of this is, and again, part of the reason I'm hanging out with the Cynet folks is they don't care about the Fortune 2000s. I mean, they do, but they don't. They're after the smaller organizations. So the ones where the IT team is smaller, the security team is running around trying to get everything sorted out. You don't necessarily have the time to ask all the questions. You might not even know what questions to ask, for crying out loud. I mean, that to me is one of the biggest frustrations in the industry. We don't have a good central place where I can go, hey, I'm looking for, endpoint. Here's the 10 questions I'm going to ask every single one of those sodding vendors. Or, for me, and we talked about this offline the other day, I know the Wistic platform. I use the Security Studio stuff. I've got an affinity because I know the guys there really well. But it's that same kind of logic. It's I want something that helps me even understand what the hell I've got to ask. Because there's so many people coming into leadership roles or who are in them that just don't have that knowledge. And unfortunately, in the vendor space, there are too many vendors that take advantage of that. I mean, AI and ML are the 2 prime examples of where we've blinded people with bullshit and they've bought into it, unfortunately. And so we've got to get much better at educating people on, to me, it's verify, and then maybe I'll think about trusting you.
Yes.
So we have a few questions. I've got some from YouTube, some from LinkedIn, and some that I got an email from some people who are name shy. So I will take the email one first, and then I want to address some of the few from YouTube and LinkedIn. So specifically talking about the complications of having valid certificates of the SolarWinds compromise. Is there an approach to counter this so that updates can be done like a sandbox or a different process? What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's totally different ways it can be done. I mean, no to it. But again, it's going to it'll take the technology, it'll take separation and segmentation, and it'll take, honestly, not just security, but it's security working with dev and ops.
Right.
To me, it's, again, Nick said it 10 times. How do we cooperate effectively? If I want to roll something out, I need that sandbox. Let's run it in test. Now let's talk to operations. How are they using it? Let's run the case studies. And we do it that way. Let's put the process in place and not fuck it up.
Gray, Nick, anything on your end to add to that?
No, I agree.
So we've got a few comments here. I'm going to pick a few for us to address. I think Sean here has something very interesting, which is talk about complete engagement and work towards a full transparent on existing frameworks. I think that's a very good comment there. So Victor talks about the security rating industries attempting to help address continuous security monitoring. This helps validate this, but how's, maybe Nick, Gray, or Chris, how do we do continuous without really sitting on someone's network or someone's app or SaaS product?
Yeah, so certainly there's a security ratings industry, kind of the external validation point, and depending on who you talk to, that that may be fully adopted in the organization, or they may not like that. We're agnostic. We support that from a company perspective. We have customers that integrate security ratings into our platform, and certainly it's another data point, right? It's not an end all be all, but it's another data point to validate things. There's an interesting trend as well about the internal, like you're talking about, James, not sitting on a network, but for example, for cloud providers, exposing some of the controls you have in your cloud environment to your prospects and customers, just like security ratings does to your external environment. I think we'll see more on that in the future as well, and certainly a topic or a theme. But again, now you're sort of piecing together a bunch of different puzzle pieces, and none of them can really stand alone. Perhaps for a certain low risk vendor or some certain use case, you can feel comfort based on one of those, but you sort of have outside in, inside out, attestation, due diligence, certification, and that's really what we're seeing. You got to put all of these pieces together to get a complete picture. So I don't know if that answers the question that Victor posed.
It does. I think you bring up a great point, which is there's so many beyond just the software supply chain and beyond my vendor's vendor, right? There's the idea of auditing and compliance and legal and certs and workforce and industry, right? I mean, there's so many different little bits and pieces there that all play a part of it. And like Gray said, and Chris have also said, and you have as well, Nick, and Excel doesn't always necessarily give you the full picture.
That's right. You got to bring those data points together. To what Nick said is, all of these become, better data for us to have better visibility and better decision making.
Well, I think
also feel if a supplier or a vendor or a third party won't participate in parts of that process, then that's not being transparent.
But could we incentivize that as a security team? Could we incentivize cooperation from vendors? So one of the things we do is we talk about, we've kind of trained our business development team and partnership team and marketing team that when we talk to companies, that when they send them the security kind of, questionnaire, we say this isn't a test, but rather a partnership. And we really want to understand what you guys are doing. We want to do business with you, which is why we're to this point and why we're, investing resources to do this audit. So please answer this truthfully. If you don't know, just put NA or don't know. And at least that way we're able to kind of look at it from that perspective and address it. And I think that's really critical. Is a lot of times these younger companies don't have the maturity to answer stuff correctly.
We had an engineering company that we were talking with and doing some like CISO work with out on the East Coast. And they just they're dealing with the CMMC stuff that's coming down the line. And the big organization that they do engineering for said, hey, we realized that this is new for you, which it was. We realized that you don't have all the resources. We will make our resources available. And I'm like, holy shit, that's fantastic. So the big organization basically made their technical resources available for consultation, for communication, for collaboration, to actually help the engineering company understand what it needed to do, should do, must do, and has to. That was amazing. And I wish I could say who the heck it was. It was one of the big, like, everybody gives them shit, one of the big, like, government type entities that does a lot of work. And most of the time they're a pain in the ass. But in this case, I'm like, okay, you went over, you did a really nice job. And so I love that, because it's the bigger company going, hey, we've got the resources. Let's help the smaller guys. I love that. It's fantastic.
And you know, that's a really good point too, Chris. And you know, I'm going to raise this too. Is, I mean, the experienced security folks in amongst us also need to play a role in helping out some of those organizations. And, you know, I did talk about, you know, we need to be a mentor and a coach, all right, because some of us have enormous amount of experience, or most of us do, and we can provide value. And I will say, and I did mention a bit earlier on, is that when we have sent out questionnaires and we started that assessment process, and it could be partners and it could be suppliers, it has led to those conversations. And in a lot of cases, I have played a role where I'm actually helping out that supplier or partner. Now, of course, there's some limits around that. I mean, I can't give all of my time to some startup, unfortunately, right? I'd love to be able to, but, you know, they don't pay my bills.
But it's guidance. You can help.
But yeah, we all have a role, I think, to play to help those folks out. And maybe this is part of the answer too, is what can we do as security folks to help out those that aren't? Because people come up with some great ideas for software, you know, and applications, and they are world changing out there at the moment. We have a role there.
And Gray, I think what that does, we talked about tasting it from the buyer side, and don't want to go back from the vendor side. What that does is it gives the immature startup or vendor the license to be more transparent, right? That in some ways, that's what we need. Like we need to make it okay to not be perfect. You know, to this point of James, you're saying, tell me if you don't understand the question I'm asking you, or if it doesn't apply, let's talk about it, as opposed to being afraid that if I answer in a non-compliant manner, it's going to eliminate the opportunity for us to do business together. We could do a better job as an industry at opening that door and saying, it's okay. I just want to know the truth.
Yeah.
I just want to engage with you on this. And if you don't answer everything 100% correct, it doesn't mean we're not going to work together.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked a lot about early on about carrots and sticks, right? And there's a part to that, but there's also a part to when I started talking about partnership and transparency, the transparency and partnership starts with us, right? And it really, we drive it as CISOs, as CEOs, as business leaders. We drive that transparency. And so that's where I find that when I drive transparency with vendors, we tend to get the answers we need to get so that we're able to help get the business done. And I think, you know, as we increase more and more transparency, as we build more partnerships, and, you know, it's almost like if, you know, I was talking to, you know, Brian over at HBO Max, right? He's the CISO. And so HBO, huge company, ton of resources, Warner, like, need I say more, right? Like gazillions of dollars, right? So, you know, we were talking about the idea of why don't they create a almost a vendor cybersecurity kind of cert process where you clear kind of a specific standard and make your standards very clear, kind of like, you know, and put that on a form, put that on a digital process as similar to, you know, a platform like Listic, and people can go in and complete it. Now, if you complete that, then you can actually bid on business, and it makes the whole process much easier. Trusted by.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And you know what? Sorry, go Nick.
No, go for it, Gray. I'll chime in after you.
I mean, look, there's consumers are looking for organizations they can trust more and more. And you know, there's some great papers that are coming out from some of the most, you know, prestigious, you know, colleges and universities around the world, and some folks. And, you know, building trust is so key. And I think this is a big part of it. Yeah. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, I was just going to say that think about that. So we've been talking about transparency, and a lot of our conversation has been from the seller to the buyer, the vendor to the customer. But think about that, the power of that in reverse. We don't often communicate clearly, here are the expectations or the deal breakers in working with me.
Yeah.
Think of what that would do for the industry as well. It's certainly something we're thinking about at Wistic as we chart the course to the future, is how do we enable buyers to be more clear about their security minimums and expectations before they ever engage with a third-party vendor, so that a third-party vendor could self-select themselves out, because we've all been in the process where you're at the final, you know, it's been through a 90-day POC, it's been through legal, lands on the security desk, and in 10 seconds, you basically say, there's no way we can work with them because they don't even, you know, they don't even meet these minimum requirements. So that transparency from the buyer side is pretty critical as well.
Here's the other thing to add on to that. I love the idea, James, but my challenge on that one is HBO often does its validation criteria. I go do business with Amazon. They got their own criteria. GE's got its own criteria. We know SLED's got its own criteria, CMMC. And all of a sudden now, as the vendor, I'm having to fill out, not only am I having to fill out my third-party attestation, I'm now having to fill out 25 different vendor ones. I want consistency. I want one freaking questionnaire. So, I want one ring to rule them all.
Well, that's it.
And I think that kind of plays into the conversation, by the way, and we're out of time. So I'll summarize, and then I want you each to throw in one little piece. But one of the things we looked at was, what if we took, you know, the Fortune 50 CISOs, right? The Bryans, the Jasons, the Tim Callahans, right? The guys who have the $500 million security budget and above.
Yeah.
Okay. And we said, let's put a working group together to create a standard in coordination with people like Gray, and utilizing a system like Wistic or any other, right? And for this case, you know, Wistic, because I like Wistic. So having, you know, so we kind of look at that and we say, what if we created some standard that these 25 companies or 25 CISOs say, these are our standards that we all guarantee to be acceptable. This is our form. Here it is. Go.
I like that idea, especially if you can get the adoption from the rest of the CISO community, or even a partial adoption.
I mean, even if it's a part, if you think of like just taking the Fortune 100 and taking a group of 10 of them, right? You get the group of the 10 buying powers, right? So it's something where it would really kind of deliver a kind of a standard. So we're 5 minutes over, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, because people are, all the comments are now coming in again. Obviously we trigger stuff at the end as well. Let's talk a little bit about best practices, guys. Maybe share one of your best practices around managing your supply chain.
Well, one of my best practices is really making sure that you've got that full life cycle. So we go out there and we ask the questions, we assess those results. We actually do put contracts in place that we call our cyber terms and conditions, which is what we expect you to do ongoing to meet that. Now, unfortunately, you never want to have to use that legal instrument. And then we go back to attestation and back into that review cycle. But we don't treat it as a box ticking exercise. Okay, it's a partnership and working together and making improvements, because you know what, if you don't do that, you're not going to have constant maturity increases. So it's got to be a full life cycle. It's not just a one-off, and it's not just tick a box.
Go for it, Nick.
Oh, just on the buyer side, one best practice would be, if you don't have a way to clearly communicate your security expectations to your business stakeholders, that's a great place to start. Because if they don't know what you expect, then they're going to slow things down. And that's the first step towards getting the vendors earlier on in the process understanding your baseline. So that's one. On the seller side, the vendor side, best practice would be proactively put your act together. If you get common questions over and over again, if you're a cloud provider, go answer the Cloud Security Alliance CAIQ. Put that in place, keep that up to date, put your documentation together, and challenge your sales teams to share that before you get asked from your customers. And instead of being reactive to all these questions, get out ahead of it. That's a best practice and a trend that we're seeing on this topic of transparency that really would help.
Yeah, I got a couple of quick ones. First one, so again, just on the SINET, one of the questions I asked, well, one of the questions we're talking about is competitive analysis. And they're like, well, I'm like, be honest. If we don't do shit, tell people we don't do shit. Tell them we're working on it, tell them what we're doing, but tell them, be honest. So the honesty, the integrity, and accountability. We're handling everybody's data. How do we become accountable to that? On the other side of the fence, I put the hillbilly side of things on. Quite honestly, I rely on a lot of threat intel. I build my own, I do my own, I roll my own. I'm working with, Six-Kill and a couple of the other companies. We rely on threat intel because unfortunately, not everybody is going to be honest, but I still need to know when something's happening and what's going on. So we validate and then maybe trust. So thank you.
Absolutely. Folks, for everyone who's been gracious to spend the last, according to YouTube, 70 minutes, thank you so much for being part of today's webinar. Thank you to our panelists, Gray, Chris, and Nick. Thank you to Wistic for helping put this together, really, and bringing Gray on board, and Nick and Chris and all of you guys for your contribution and time. Really immensely amazing. It's funny, I'm getting messages here of people who, because we were drinking scotch, are now drinking Jameson. So which is you can't argue with taste or flavor.
Ooh, Rider's Tears or a good red breast, like a Lasala red breast. Or green spot, yellow spot, or red spec. Come on, there's better out there.
There are plenty, but I always say, there's a saying in Hebrew, it means with taste and smell, there's very little to argue about, because it's all a personal point of privilege, right? Totally. So totally. Having said that, I want to say thank you for everyone. Thank you to Wistic again. Thank you to everyone who participated. For those who weren't able to make it, just by registering, we'll send you the recording of today's episode of the webinar. It will be available for two weeks just by going to our website, CyberHub Podcast, or going to our LinkedIn page and getting it. The link on YouTube will go private here in just a moment, folks. So if you didn't live stream it, you're going to have to sign up to get it. So
awesome. Thanks.
With that being said, folks, happy St. Paddy's Day. Eat some corned beef and cabbage, and thank you all. Thank you everyone for your comments and the lively discussion. Again, this panel was a blast, but it wouldn't have been as much of fun without all of you guys.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks to everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.